Today is story time. Today we're looking at storytelling. We're looking at how to tell a great story. You've heard it said, haven't you? Everybody loves a story. Well, it's not actually true. Well, it's not quite true. Because while everybody loves a story, what they really love is a well-written story or a well-told story. The art of telling a great story. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in this lesson together. You know, the Bible is full of stories. It's a story book, isn't it? It's full from the start to the beginning, Genesis to Revelation. It's a book of stories. And there are some classic stories in the Bible. I wonder what your favorite stories are. What are your favorite stories to read? What are your favorite stories to tell, to preach? You know, Noah and the Ark. It's a great story, a story of God's redemptive plan. Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. It's a great war story, if you like war. David and Goliath. The little guy takes down the big guy. Everybody loves that kind of story. It's a triumphant story, overcoming the odds. Jonah and the whale. That's a great story. What do you think makes that a great story? I think it's the fact that it's almost unbelievable. Really? A guy gets swallowed by a whale and then spewed up onto the beach 3 days later. Did it really happen? It is a great story. Ruth and Boaz. If you love love stories, then that's a great love story right there. The feeding of the 5,000. It's a miraculous story. 3 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 men plus women and children are fed. It's a miraculous story. Paul and Silas. Do you like a good escape story? I love escape stories. I love the old British war movies where, you know, they have to escape. But if you like an escape story, then Paul and Silas in jail and there's an earthquake and the chains fell off and they escape. These are great stories. They're great because they're well-written stories. They're good to read. But how do you tell a good story? One thing to read a good story, how do you tell a good story? Before we get there, think about what makes a story good to read. Somebody once said, the great writer's gift to a reader is to make him a better writer. So what makes a good story in order, in relation to reading that story? Well, I think there's some thoughts there. A good story, to read a good story is a story that hooks you in. It refuses to let you go. You can't put the book down. My wife loves reading. She'll be reading sometimes till 3 or 4 in the morning. In the morning, I'll say to her, I just couldn't put it down. A good story to read has sensual detail and information, emotion and feeling. You know, it makes you sad, it makes you angry, it makes you excited, it arouses you in some way. Stories that are good to read are stories that have distinct and interesting characters. Characters that you can identify with. I love Seinfeld. I think there's a little bit of George Costanza in all of us. You can identify, with these characters. I think stories are good to read when the stakes are high, when there's a plausible plot. I don't like to read or tell stories that have a weak storyline or a weak plot. I like the elements of surprise. These are all the elements, if you like, of a good story. I like the unexpected twists and turns. I like to think or say, wow, I didn't see that coming. To me, that's what makes a good story. I like tragic stories, but yet there's some humor there to balance it. I like a right level of ambiguity in a story. I love a little bit of mystique. I don't want all the questions answered. A good story to me leaves you thinking, why? How? What was that about? To me, these are the characteristics or the qualities of a good story, a well-written story. But how about telling a story? How do you tell a good story? Well, I think first and foremost, there are 3 golden rules that we ought to observe when it comes to telling a story. They are the primary guidelines, if you like, of telling a story. And they're in your notes there. Let's have a look at them together. The first golden rule is this: no story from your life or the life of others is as interesting to others as it is to you. Your story is amazing. Your story is fantastic. You can't wait for somebody to ask you, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself. Have you ever said that to someone? Hey, someone you haven't met before, and you meet them for the first time, and you say, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself. And they launch into, well, I was born in 1965 in Scunthorpe in England. Scunthorpe's west of Manchester. It's south of Liverpool. It's north of Lincoln. It's on the coast. And you think, oh, no, I shouldn't have asked. And we're going to be here for hours and hours now as they tell their story. You want to tell your whole story. A lot of people are looking for that opportunity. Give me the microphone. I've got a story to tell. You ever been sitting around telling stories and, after the first couple, you get those people that say, I've got a better story. I can one-up you on that story. And, the truth is that good storytellers don't feel compelled to tell the whole story. They don't have to give you their whole life story when sharing a personal story or one incident or one accident or one aspect of their story. Good storytellers are concise. Good storytellers are not so much interested in the chronology of the story, but rather turning points. Turning points. I think sometimes we have to, as storytellers, lose the chronology and focus on the turning points. Let me give you an example. A classic example is Adam and Eve in the garden. We love that story, the genesis of humanity. We've got Adam, we've got Eve that are in the garden, and they've got beautiful, unadulterated fellowship with God. But all of us have asked the question. All of us want to know. What do we want to know? Come on, you know. We all want to know, how long were they in the garden before the serpent came and tempted them? Now, we would all like to think that they were in the garden for 1,000 years before that happened. We don't like to think that it happened on day 2. Come on, be honest. But the Bible doesn't tell us. It's not so interested in the chronology of events. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. It doesn't take long to get into the story of Adam and Eve until there is the temptation and the fall of man. Because that's the turning point. Yes, they had fellowship. The turning point, she took the apple and ate it. Here's the golden rule. Edit your story. Avoid unimportant tangents. And we can all go off on tangents and end up describing facts and communicating aspects of the story that don't really need to be told. Number 2, in terms of primary observations in telling a great story, is that a great story must have conflict. Great stories have conflict. Great stories share the reality of humanity. Difficulties and challenges and fears, disaster, tragedy, over or rather than triumph. We've just had the Olympic Games, and it's interesting to me how the media focus not so much on the gold medal winners, but they tend to focus on those who should have won gold that didn't even win bronze. Why didn't you win? We've got these athletes that won gold, but we want to focus on those that didn't win the gold, that were supposed to win the gold. There's something about the struggle and the fight and the hardship and the lack and the disappointment that engages people. I think of, the Bible stories. Many of the stories, they focus on tragedy. They focus on conflict, hardship, battle, the fight, the struggle. Imperfection, lack, conflict, enchants listeners. We want to hear about that. We love it that you triumphed, but we want to know about the struggle. We want to know what that was like. How did you feel when your husband left you? How did you feel when you went bankrupt? How did you feel your first kiss? It's not just the facts, it's the feelings, and it's the conflict, the inner turmoil that you go through. That's what people want to hear. That's what we need to be telling when we tell a story. I think of the Apostle Paul. What makes him such a great apostle is the struggle that he had with his apostleship and the conflict that there was there. He was shipwrecked and imprisoned, and this thorn in his flesh. What was that thorn in the flesh? Who knows? Who cares? The fact is that his life was a struggle. It was a fight, continual, daily fight. And that's what people want to hear when we tell a story. We want triumph over hardship, but we want the hardship. That's what people relate to. Stories have to have conflict. The third thing that we notice about great storytelling is that great stories involve turning points. Now, I mentioned them before. Let me just say another couple of things about turning points. Stories that move you through the turning point. Characters that are subjected to pressure, yet in amongst that pressure, they're able to turn their life around, turn the situation around, and bring change. The classic example of this is the prodigal son. This is a great story. If you're a preacher, you've preached on it many, many times. I've preached on it 20, 30, 50 times. There's so much in that story. But if you notice, of the verses there, it's not long into the story that you get the turning point. There's not a lot of chronology. It amazes me that there's a mention of the father and the two boys, but not of the mother. Well, what of the mother? How old were the boys? All of this information is not given us. But what's given us is a boy asks for an early release of his inheritance. He gets it, he wastes it, and within 2 to 3, 4 verses, we discover a turning point. He comes to his senses, the turning point. We don't need too much information about the prostitutes. We don't need a whole lot of detail about how he wasted that money and the detail of the prodigal living. The story is a guy he wastes, but he turns his life around. And that's the point of the story. Something magical happens. Somehow he comes to his senses. It's through the work of the Holy Spirit, or however it happens, he comes to his senses. You see, a great story has a struggle that leads to change. So when we're telling stories, what makes those stories great is that we're concise. We get to the point. What makes a great story is that once we've got to that point in that story, then we communicate the struggle of that story and the conflict. And then we bring a resolution out of that conflict. There are turning points. Every story's got to have that turning point. We don't leave people in the tragedy. We don't leave the prodigal son in the pig pen with no food to eat. There's a turning point, and then we describe that turning point. Let's look then, in the few minutes we've got left, of how to tell a good story. Let me give you 7 thoughts on telling a good story. Number 1, to tell a good story, you've got to believe you're a good storyteller. You've got to believe that you are a good storyteller. You know where I started to learn to tell stories? By lying to my parents. That's how I started my journey of telling stories. I know that's probably not a good thing to admit, but have a think about this. To lie takes a lot of creativity. To build up a story, as an excuse or a reason why you didn't do what you were supposed to do, or, I was a very creative liar. I mean, a very creative storyteller. That's how I learned my craft. I then developed that craft when I became a parent. I said to my wife, let me be the bedtime storyteller. Here's what I do. I sit in bed with my girls and I'd say, okay, I can tell you one of two stories. I can tell you the Three Little Pigs and we can read that story. Or I can tell you a story and I'd give them multiple choice options. I can tell you the story about the little girl. I have 4 daughters, so it always involves girls. We're not going anywhere near those boys just yet. So I can tell you a story about a little girl who lost her teddy bear in the forest. I can tell you, when they get a little bit older, I can tell you the story of the little girl who had her first kiss. Oh, that's silly. And I give them the choice. Oh, Dad, tell me the story about the little bear, the little girl who lost her teddy bear in the forest. Well, the thing is, I've now got to come up with a story. And you know what? An hour later, I'm telling the story. I'm making it up as I go. And my wife will come in. I think story time's finished now. Oh, we're not there yet, my daughter would say. I believe I'm a good storyteller. And that's why I can tell good stories. If you don't believe you're a storyteller, if you don't practice, if you don't develop that craft, you won't be a good storyteller. You'll be average. You'll be mediocre. Number 2, know your audience. If you want to be a good storyteller, know your audience. I turned up to a conference once. I was told that it was a young adult conference. When we got there, there were 3,000 women. It was a warrior princess conference. How many of you know my messages and my stories were not going to hit the mark? You have to know your audience and tailor-make those stories to fit the audience. Number 3, show, don't tell. Show, don't read. You have to recreate the scenes. T.D. Jakes is a brilliant preacher, a brilliant storyteller. When he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, it's unbelievable. You know, the Bible says, doesn't it, there was a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. That's all it says. That's all it tells us about that road. You Google it and listen to the way T.D. Jakes describes that road. He puts you on that road. He paints a picture which paints 1,000 words. He'll tell you about that road, that treacherous, notorious road. That road that has shadows cast on it by the lack of sunlight. It's a dark, slippery, damp, wet, cold, stony road. He talks about the crevices in the rock faces that line that road, where the thieves, the robbers, the highway robbers, the bandits, the rustlers hide in those crevices, waiting for those unsuspecting victims. I tell you, he brings that road to life. He puts you on that road. He's walked that road. We have to show stories. We have to create those scenes, paint those pictures, and put the people in it. Number 4, every story's got to have a hero. Your story needs a hero. Give the audience a hero to identify with. Jesus did this, didn't he? I mean, the story of the Good Samaritan. The story's told, then Jesus says, who's the hero? Who is the hero? You're the hero in that story. Because Jesus says, go and do likewise. He's calling you to be the hero. You to love your neighbor. Sure, the Samaritan's a hero, but more to the point, you're a hero. Tell a story and call people to heroic acts of kindness and love and mercy and grace. Number 5, be creative. Embellish without distorting the story. Color your story. It's got to come alive when you tell it. You know, being a storyteller is a license to thrill, not to embarrass, not to belittle, not to dishonor or abuse people, but it's a license to thrill people with your story. And number 6, challenge people with a point. Here's a thought. Avoid telling people the moral of the story. If you've got to tell them the moral, you haven't told the story well enough. You only get halfway through the Good Samaritan and you realise that God's calling you to be a Good Samaritan. You don't have to wait till the end. Number 7, keep it short. The rule of thumb is the elevator story. You have to be able to tell your story in the time it takes you to get in that elevator and go to the 50th floor. A minute or two is long enough for you to tell your story. Hey, good preachers, good communicators are good storytellers. Develop the craft. Develop the art of telling a good story.